Hello and welcome to The Arise interview, 60 minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagulu. Coming up in the next hour, for decades, Cuba's involvement in Africa has been for some that of a friend, and for others something of a shrewd power play, particularly during the Cold War. The relationship, though, has survived that battleground and continues to blossom across the continent, including here in Nigeria. One man who's helped to deepen Cuba's footprint in Africa is the Cuban ambassador to Nigeria, Carlos Trejo Sosa. After 5 years, his time as Cuba's top diplomat here is coming to an end. He gives his valedictory interview on the program today. And later, you may not know this, but more Africans are now estimated to be dying from cancer than malaria. This dramatic shift from the burden of infectious diseases such as malaria to communicable diseases such as cancer represents an enormous challenge to healthcare systems across the continent. We'll listen in to a global call to action to address Africa's cancer crisis in a moment. Now, when Africa was a battleground between the Cold War powers of the US and the Soviet Union, Cuba emerged as a friend of liberation movements on the continent, sending soldiers, doctors, and teachers at a time when post-colonial Africa was perhaps at its most vulnerable. Today, the country still trains African doctors and continues to send Cuban doctors here. When Ebola ravaged Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, Cuba led international efforts at a time when the rest of the world prevaricated. The island nation's healthcare system is still the envy of the world. Cuba has universal healthcare for all its citizens, posting some of the best outcomes in the world in terms of infant mortality and life expectancy, and is a world leader in biotechnology. The country has offered to help Nigeria end medical tourism, which costs millions of dollars a year. In a moment, we'll speak to the outgoing Cuban ambassador to Nigeria about all that. But first, here's a brief, rather colorful, touristy look at the island of Cuba.
It's only 93 miles from Florida and just 13 from the Bahamas. But like the smoke that coils from its legendary cigars, the Republic of Cuba exists in the time and space all its own. Blending the traditions of Spain, Africa, and its native peoples, and lit by the fires of independence and revolution, the aromas, textures, and flavors of this Caribbean nation are like no other. Despite its size, Cuba has punched well above its weight. For centuries, its vast plantations satisfied a global appetite for sugar and thirst for the smoothest rums. In 1962, it played center stage in a nuclear standoff, which made the planet hold its breath for 13 days. And through it all, its infectious rhythms taught the world how to move its hips. Few cities can stir the imagination like Cuba's capital, Havana, a city preserved by forts and citadels, a 5-mile seawall, and an imposed embargo which held back the excesses of the 20th century for over 50 years. Havana's symbol is La Giradilla, dedicated to the city's first female governor, who scanned the horizon each day for her husband's return from the sea. 400 years later, she continues to wait high above the Castillo de la Real Fuerza, the city's original fort. While her husband never returned from his explorations, today she watches as millions of travelers come to explore her city. The fort overlooks Plaza de Armas, the birthplace and heart of Old Havana. step into the cool colonial elegance of the Palace of the Captains General. Once home of governors, today the home of the Museum of the City of Havana.
Well, that's a brief look at Cuba. Well, after 5 years, Cuba's top diplomat in Nigeria, Ambassador Carlos Trejo Sosa, is departing these shores. He's kindly agreed to grant us a valedictory interview, and he joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Were you feeling a bit like, I've got to rush home looking at those pictures?
Well, I think it's a mixture of sad and joy.
Yes, I can
Sad
imagine.
because I'm leaving my friends here, the country where I've been living for the last 5 years intensively. And happy because at last I'm going to meet my family there and stay a bit with them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Going to see your family is always a good thing. And I was just looking at those pictures. Everything there, of course, very true, because I've been to Cuba, I've been to Havana, I've been to Veradera. Lovely, lovely sort of country. But this is, of course, a sort of valedictory interview. So perhaps you can afford not to take the diplomatic approach in your answers. Let me begin then by asking you to briefly assess for us the time you've spent here in Nigeria.
I think it is one of my best times I have spent as an ambassador, as a diplomat in my long, long career in this profession.
Well, there you go, speaking like a diplomat.
No, I'm not. First, because I don't feel myself as a foreigner in their country.
Right.
Because I also consider mine, as our ancestors, and also mine, come from this country, especially from the land of the Yorubas and Calabars, mainly. Not only, but mainly.
You mean people from Calabar in the
Yes.
Cross River state?
Yes,
Yeah.
we have a lot of descendants, and our people keep traditions in Cuba exactly as you keep there in Nigeria. But to my recall, when the late Oni went to Cuba in 1987,
The Oni of Ife.
Oni of Ife, yes,
Right.
was invited to visit Cuba in 1987 by the late President Fidel Castro. And when he was there, so he was visiting some museums we have, where we keep all our traditions and things like that in regard to the connection with Africa. And he cried, because he said that I heard things and tunes in Cuba which were already forgotten in Nigeria. And also the language which is used in our processions and performances is the late or the last or ancient language of the Yoruba land. So it's the same, you see, but still back in the 19th century.
Well, we're going to talk a bit about that culture a bit later in the program, but I have to say that I was in Cuba. I saw Santeria, the religion, in practice, and a lot of it, as you correctly said, borrowed from Yoruba traditions that survived after the slaves came over. And interestingly, you mentioned your relationship with the Yorubas and people from Calabar, because of course those were the two areas where most of the slaves left the shores of Africa and West Africa from. Let's talk about the people that you've met here that left you with a bad feeling and that you'd really rather not meet again.
I don't have any recall about that.
Come on now.
No. I can say that I'm even in the market, you know, when you have to go and bargain from time to time, because we like that, as you like Nigerians. And I don't recall any bad experience in Nigeria up to the moment. On the contrary, when I met my friends here and people from the government, I said that I'm amazed by the way the education, the grassroots education of the people. So things which in some part of the world are already lost, but you keep that in Nigeria. So you always are met here, are met with good morning, sorry sir, whatever, all beautiful words which are expressed here, which make you feel very well. So I cannot recall any bad, time in Nigeria. I cannot say. If I try to say, I'm trying to then to search in the nothing, because it doesn't exist.
And what about the decisions that you made here that you regret as a diplomat?
No, I don't regret. I regret that many of the things I proposed have not yet been fulfilled. Since my arrival in Nigeria, I've been trying to do as much as possible to put our countries, our people together. So relations with Nigeria has always been excellent all the time. But there are few things which is necessary to continue pushing forward. So you cannot keep relations only on the basis of beautiful speeches, exchanges, compliments. So we need to fill the relationship with things which are useful and good for the benefit of the two peoples.
Right. So as you prepare to leave Nigeria, what would be your defining statement of Cuban foreign policy here today?
I think that Cuban foreign policy in relation to Nigeria as part of Africa, it's a priority. When I left Cuba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs told me, make our brothers and sisters of Nigeria really believe that Nigeria is a priority for Cuba, and it is.
Right. And what do you think about, because obviously one of the things that Nigeria hopes to, I mean, you and I were talking last night, and one of the things that you talked about was how you were hoping to strengthen healthcare in Nigeria, for example. I mean, I don't know to what extent you achieved that, and whether you see that as being in sync with the pace of reform that you would expect from a country like Nigeria.
Well, first I would say that Nigeria deserves a better place in terms of healthcare. So the position of Nigeria in the world scale is not one of the best. One of the richest countries, highest populated, with very talented people, with excellent professionals in the area of healthcare, and not putting the country in the place it should be. Statistics are showing that is not, I would say, not acceptable. And then we think that we have achieved a lot of things during the last 60 years, despite, as you mentioned before, the American blockade. You call that embargo, but for us it's blockade, because it goes much beyond the bilateral relations. And so we have achieved many things. Maybe the need have made Cuba to invent, create, and obtain results. And then I think that those results prove that our system, what we are doing in my country, is working for Cuba. So we don't try to export our experiences anywhere. As I said many times to my friends here in Nigeria, when we come to Africa, we never come to teach, we come to share. Because as we consider this the home of our ancestors, you cannot come back to the home of your ancestors and say and teach them how to do. So it's disrespect, and we do not that.
Yeah, nevertheless, you can give them a kick to say, hey, get moving here. Cuba's been facing a blockade, as you put it, for many years. Look what it's done with its healthcare system. You don't have to worry about a blockade. Where do you stand as far as that goes? But let me just ask you, Ambassador, to stay with us, because I'm going to take a short break, but we'll continue this fascinating chat. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our valedictory interview with Cuba's top diplomat in Nigeria, Ambassador Carlos Trejo Sosa, who is departing these shores after 5 years. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, when Cuba and Nigeria hit the international headlines, it's usually on a sour note. War, poverty, human rights. Cuba is exporting Marxism to Africa, and that is unacceptable, which is the usual cry from the West. Well, all that is controversial stuff, but there is the other non-controversial side of that coin. Cuba's historical attachments to Africa is strong. Once upon a time, African slaves were taken to Cuba by the Spanish to work on their sugar plantations. To this day, much of the culture they took with them persists in Cuba and is heavily reflected in Cuban music, which has many fans in Africa, just as traditional African music remains strong in Cuba today. Well, the outgoing Cuban ambassador to Nigeria, Carlos Trejo Sosa, is with me in the studio. Before we continue our chat with him, let's take a look at this video that reflects the continuing connection between Cuban and African music.
The frenzied rhythm of the El Alacron dance troupe signals the start of Carnival in one of Havana's poorest neighborhoods. To begin the season, the dancers spin paper lanterns as the crowd spits on them with mouthfuls of rum and beer. It's a purification ritual of Santeria, a religious mix of Catholicism and ancestral worship introduced to Cuba by Nigerian slaves hundreds of years ago.
The dancers reenact ancient rituals during which we baptize paper lanterns that symbolize divinities, like the gods Hemanhia and Chango. And all of this is done in an artistic manner.
El Alacron is a name taken from an island legend about a young slave. He was stung by an unknown deadly insect in a sugarcane plantation. A wise man identified it as a scorpion. More elaborate in years past, the troupe's director said the dances are more subdued today. Economic restrictions in this communist nation have reduced their access to desired props.
Usually we have 15 lanterns, but it's only with a great deal of difficulty that we have managed to find 9 for Carnival.
El Alacron is the oldest carnival dance troupe on the island. Its traditional dances have been transmitted from generation to generation since 1908.
Like a whirling dervish, if you ask me. Lovely stuff. And the outgoing Cuban ambassador to Nigeria, Carlos Trejo Sosa, is still with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us. You were talking about that strong connection. I was in Cuba. I mean, Santeria religion, very, very prominent. The dance rhythms, something that is really an essential part of Cuban culture, isn't it?
It is. Africa and Nigeria are part of the Cuban nation. I would say that they are in the roots of the Cuban nation. If you take into account that in the 19th century, the population of Cuba was around 2.2 million inhabitants. Out of them, 1.6 million were Africans. And amongst them, more than 80% came from the west coast of Nigeria. And then the traditions and cultural performances were very close, as remain until today. And apart from that, the blood links between the two countries. So maybe you can think that I'm white. I'm not. I'm mixed.
Okay.
Maybe I'm white because I look white in your eyes, but I'm not. I have as many African genes as you have.
Right. No, I can imagine. But I mean, it's interesting the way the Caribbean is sort of distributed in terms of the blood mix or the ethnic mix, depending on where people have come from. Because I mean, if you go to Cuba, obviously, and I think possibly Jamaica, quite a lot of Yorubas who are there. I mean, when I mean Yorubas, I mean Yoruba origins. If you go to a place like Haiti, for example, there are a lot of Igbos who come from that part of the continent. So it's an absolutely fascinating thing. But let's turn to other matters, political matters in Nigeria. There have been elections. I mean, you've seen 2 big elections whilst you were here, 2015, 2019. How would you characterize the state of politics in this country?
It's amazing. I can confess that it is amazing, and it is a great nation with a lot of traditions. So I would say that Nigeria is composed of different ethnic groups where allegiance sometimes are related to those different differences in ethnic groups. Not only in terms of, I would say, religion, because you can find Christians in the north and Muslims in the south. And the way you carry out the elections in Nigeria, for any foreigner viewer, it's a bit, I would say, complicated.
To put it politely.
Yes, it is complicated, the participation in the elections is quite high. It's not small, despite all the problems you have with the communications, with transportations and many things like that. But I have to say something. I don't like that people fight each other and kill each other because of politics. Because life is not politics only.
Well, absolutely. Let's turn to your country, Cuba. It's evolved in many ways in the last few years. I think probably since when President Obama was there was a sort of coming in from the cold, and then Donald Trump came in and it went back into the cold.
Yes.
Is that how you see it?
Well, very bad. I have to see that very bad. We had good expectancies when Mr. Obama decided to declare that the so-called embargo, that the blockade was a failure, which had failed for the last 50-something years, and it should not be expected that it would be successful in the next 50 years. So and he decided to make steps towards the right direction. So many things were done. We signed 22 agreements with the government of the United States, which were beneficial for the two sides, very much beneficial. And then many things kept already at the time, closed. And for example, the embargo, which can be lifted only by the Parliament of the United States, I mean Congress and Senate. But that's it's a reminiscence of the Cold War, which should not exist because Cuba is a very tiny island which poses no threat to anybody in the world. And we have a community of around 2 million Cubans living in the United States, working hard there, very hard on making that country also to raise.
But it's interesting that a lot of those Cubans in America support American foreign policy towards
Not
Cuba.
a lot, a small minority. So according to the polls carried out in the United States and especially in Florida, the immense majority of the Cuban living there are opposing that policy. Why? Because that policy prevents them from having normal connections with their families. So it was a time when the President of the United States decided who was your family. So your family, the circle of your family was your father, your mother, your sons, and nobody else.
But is there a particular reason why Cuba can't just adopt a multi-party system like most democracies around the world?
Well, we are coming the other way round. So we had in Cuba over 50 parties before 1959. And Cuba was one of the poorest countries in America, in Latin America, so that what the politicians did in Cuba was nothing to be happy about crimes. So some people claim that Pinochet in Chile killed about 2,500 people in 13, 14 years. So Batista killed 7,000 Cubans in less than 7 years, in 20,000 Cubans in less than 7 years. So the poverty, the backwardness of the country moved the country towards a revolution. No, it was not imported. You cannot export revolutions. Revolutions are carried out by the people inside when they are suffering, they are having their shortages, when they are seeing that their family are dying, that there are no opportunities. So people begin to think, even though they don't go to school or they were not highly prepared. But anyway, so they know that something has to change. So people got fed up in Cuba with political parties. So there is one single political party in Cuba, which is the Communist Party, a party which has no right in the Constitution to run for elections. Elections in Cuba are different. So our deputies in Cuba are not selected by parties, but by the people in the neighborhoods. So those people, once elected, they don't get salaries. They have to perform, they have to deliver their duties, receiving the salary they receive in their places of work. If you are a TV conductor and you get here $500, for example, that's your salary. And then you have to do your work here, and then after that, to meet your constituent,
But beyond the politics, I mean, most people in most countries just want to live their lives. I mean, they want to be able to travel if they want to. They want to be able to send their children to good schools. They want to be able to relate to the rest of the world, and they can't do that in Cuba.
Who said that?
Well, I mean, I've been to Cuba.
Well, my friend, but perhaps you didn't see that in a country with 10 million inhabitants, we have 1.5 million people graduated in universities.
I understand that, but there were places that the people could not go. For example, in the tourist resorts where we were, they couldn't go
That
there.
changed long ago. That was
Right.
past an old policy. So one of the main streams of tourists we have in Cuba are the local ones. In the month of June, July, August, and September, so all the tourist places are filled by Cubans.
So here you are, your last few days, 5 years and 9 days, as you correctly pointed out.
Yeah.
You've got, like, you're leaving on Sunday, I
On
understand.
Sunday, yes.
So you've got, you know, a few more days to go. What are your final thoughts on Nigeria as you prepare to depart?
Well, I think that Nigeria is striving, is fighting for a very future. So we can only support the efforts of Nigeria in any endeavor for their people. Because take into account that we consider Nigeria as part of our nation, or part of our family. And what you want for your family is the best. That's why we have said to many people in Nigeria, to the Honorable Minister last night, but much before that, and the Minister of Sciences and other ministers, that Cuba is ready to work with Nigeria in areas in which we have achieved some successes.
Right. Well, I hope that they're listening to what you're saying and that they will extend or take advantage of the hand that you're offering them. Ambassador Carlos Trejo Sosa, Cuban ambassador to Nigeria, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including as Africa experiences a dramatic shift from the burden of infectious diseases such as malaria to non-communicable diseases such as cancer. We'll discuss calls for global action to address Africa's cancer crisis. Stay with us.